Welcome to the Chosen Few. Before we begin today's story, I want you to do something. It's a small gesture, but it's going to represent everything we're about to talk about. I want you to pause for a second and pick a single number. Any number, between 1 and 100. Write it in the comments, put it in your phone, or just hold it firmly in your mind. Today, we are looking at Operation Catapult and the tragedy at Mers-el-Kébir. It's a story of a hateful choice, a broken alliance, and 15 minutes of fire that changed the course of World War II. But for you, that number you just picked is more than a digit. It represents your life. By the end of this video, we're going to look at the deck of the French battleship Bretagne. And based on the number you chose, you'll find out if you were one of the few who walked away, or if you were one of the hundreds who never stood a chance. Let's head to the coast of Algeria, July 1940. By the end of June 1940, the map of Europe had turned a terrifying shade of field grey. France, considered possessing the finest army on the continent, had collapsed in just 6 weeks. Britain now stood alone, a small island facing the undisputed master of Europe across a narrow strip of water. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was haunted by a nightmare. It wasn't just the German Luftwaffe or the Wehrmacht that kept him awake, it was the Marine Nationale, the French Navy. France possessed the second most powerful fleet in Europe. They had modern, fast battleships like the Dunkirk and the Strasbourg, floating steel castles that could outrun and outgun almost anything the British Royal Navy possessed. When France signed the armistice with Hitler on June 22nd, the fate of these ships became the single most critical issue in the war. Article 8 of the armistice stated that the French fleet would remain under French control, docked in their home ports, and, crucially, would not be used by Germany. The head of the French Navy, Admiral François Darlan, had sworn a solemn oath to Churchill. No German hand would ever touch a French ship. He had even sent secret, coded orders to every captain in the fleet. If any foreign power attempted to seize their vessels, they were to scuttle them immediately. To the French naval officers, reeling from the humiliation of national defeat, their ships were the last remaining sovereign territory of France. They were beacons of national honor in a sea of disgrace. They trusted Darlan, and they naively trusted the armistice terms. Winston Churchill, however, trusted Hitler not at all. He looked at the mathematics of survival. If Germany seized the French fleet and combined it with the Italian Navy, which had just entered the war, the Royal Navy would lose control of the Atlantic. Britain would starve. Churchill made a decision that he later called hateful, a decision that sickened every sailor charged with carrying it out. He initiated Operation Catapult. The objective: seize, neutralize, or destroy the French fleet simultaneously around the world. The largest concentration of French power lay in French Algeria, in the fortified harbour of Mers-el-Kébir near Oran. On the morning of July 3, 1940, the haze off the North African coast lifted to reveal a terrifying sight to the French sailors on watch. It was Force H, a massive British battle squadron led by the pride of the Royal Navy, the mighty battlecruiser HMS Hood, flanked by 2 battleships and an aircraft carrier. These were ships the French knew intimately. Just weeks ago, they had sailed alongside them as allies against fascism. Now, their massive 15-inch guns were slowly rotating, training not on the open sea, but toward the harbour mouth. Commanding Force H was British Admiral James Somerville. He was a man sick with dread. He wrote in his diary that this was an absolutely filthy job. His orders from London were inflexible. The French ships in that harbour must not be allowed to fall to Germany. Inside the harbour, the French fleet was trapped by geography and procedure. The majestic battleships Dunkirk, Strasbourg, Provence, and Bretagne were moored stern to the quay against a massive concrete breakwater. This arrangement saved space, but it meant their bows, and their main armament, were pointed toward the land, not out to sea. To bring their guns to bear on the British, they would have to untie, fire up cold boilers, and agonizingly turn around in a confined space. They were sitting ducks. As the sun began to bake the Algerian coast, a small British destroyer detached from Force H and headed toward the harbour boom. It carried a messenger, Captain Cedric Holland, bearing an ultimatum that would shatter the centuries-old code of naval brotherhood. The long day of the guns had begun. The tragedy of Mers-el-Kébir was compounded by a comedy of errors, ego, and rigid naval etiquette. The British envoy, Captain Cedric Holland, was chosen because he spoke impeccable French and was personally liked by many French officers. Yet, when he arrived at the harbour entrance at 8 a.m., the French commander, Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensol, refused to see him. Gensol was a proud, stiff-necked aristocrat. He was deeply offended that the British had sent a mere captain to negotiate with a vice-admiral. It was a breach of protocol that Gensol would not abide, even with British battleships aiming at his hull. He sent his flag lieutenant to meet Holland at the harbour boom instead. For hours, under the searing North African sun, the negotiations took place in a small launch bobbing between the fleets. The British ultimatum was stark. It offered Gensol 4 choices, delivered more in sorrow than in anger. Sail out and join the British to continue the fight against Germany. Sail to a British port, where the crews would be repatriated. Sail to a faraway French port in the West Indies, like Martinique, to be demilitarized under American observation. Or, if he refused these, scuttle his ships where they sat. The ultimatum closed with a chilling final paragraph. If Gensol refused all options, Force H had orders to use whatever force was necessary to prevent the ships from falling into German hands. Admiral Gensol, reading the terms in his stifling cabin on the Dunkirk, was furious. He viewed the ultimatum not as an offer to save his fleet's honor, but as a gun to his head. To join the British was, in his eyes, mutiny against his legitimate government in Vichy. He believed the German armistice was binding. Crucially, Gensol did not fully communicate the option of sailing to the West Indies, the most palatable choice, to his superiors back in France. Instead, he radioed Vichy that he was being threatened by the British and intended to resist. Vichy immediately ordered French reinforcements, cruisers and submarines from nearby Algiers and Toulon, to speed to Mers-el-Kébir to aid Gensol. The British Admiralty intercepted these signals. London panicked. If French submarines arrived, Force H would be vulnerable. The pressure on Admiral Somerville mounted. Churchill sent urgent cables. Settle matters quickly. Throughout the afternoon, the tension in the harbour became unbearable. British aircraft dropped magnetic mines in the harbour entrance to prevent escape. French sailors, realizing the gravity of the situation, began frantically preparing their ships for battle, lighting boilers that had been cold for days. By 4 p.m., Admiral Somerville was desperate. He had delayed past his original deadline. He finally convinced Gensol to meet Captain Holland face-to-face aboard the Dunkirk. It was a heartbreaking meeting. Holland, a Francophile, pleaded with Gensol desperately to accept the terms. He pointed to the overwhelming British firepower waiting outside. Gensol, stubborn and relying on his honor, refused to budge. He showed Holland the secret orders from Darla to scuttle the ships only if the Germans tried to seize them, arguing the British had nothing to fear. But it was too late for promises. At 5:15 p.m., while Holland was still aboard the French flagship, a final signal arrived from Churchill to Somerville. French ships must comply with our terms or sink themselves or be sunk by you before dark. At 5:54 p.m., Captain Holland, heavy-hearted, saluted Admiral Gensol and departed the Dunkirk. As his small motorboat sped away toward the harbour entrance, the massive 15-inch turrets of HMS would finish their final adjustments. The deadline had passed. The talking was over. At 5:54 p.m. on July 3, 1940, Admiral Somerville gave the order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The silence of the Algerian evening was shattered by the thunderous roar of Force H. The first salvo signaled the start of a slaughter. The French ships were trapped against the breakwater, unable to maneuver. Because they were moored stern first, their massive forward guns couldn't turn far enough to target the British ships on the horizon. They were helpless giants. The British gunnery was devastatingly accurate. The action lasted barely 15 minutes. The battleship Provence was hit immediately, set ablaze, and forced to beach herself to avoid sinking. The flagship Dunkirk took 4 massive 15-inch shell hits. destroying her electrical systems and half her crew, forcing her to run aground. The destroyer Mogador, attempting to make a run for the harbour mouth, took a direct hit to her stern depth charges. The resulting explosion blew the back of the ship entirely off. But the greatest tragedy befell the older battleship, Bretagne. A British salvo struck the Bretagne near her magazines. The ship was consumed by a colossal explosion, a pillar of fire and smoke rising thousands of feet into the air. She capsized almost instantly, trapping hundreds of men below decks in the darkness and rapidly rising water. In less than 10 minutes, the Bretagne was gone, taking 977 French sailors down with her. Amidst the chaos, smoke, and burning oil, one French ship achieved the impossible. The captain of the battlecruiser Strasbourg ordered his mooring lines cut with axes. Utilizing the smoke screen from the burning Bretagne as cover, the Strasbourg, accompanied by 5 destroyers, zigzagged through the minefield at the harbour entrance and escaped into the open Mediterranean. Despite attacks by British aircraft, she made it safely to the French port of Toulon a day later. Her escape was a tactical failure for the British, but the strategic message had been delivered in blood. By 6:10 p.m., Somerville ordered a ceasefire. The harbour was a graveyard of wrecked ships and dead men. The human cost was staggering. 1,297 French sailors were killed, more than France had lost in many major naval battles of the past. The British lost 2 airmen. The political fallout was instantaneous and toxic. The Vichy government immediately severed diplomatic relations with Britain. In France, the attack was viewed as a supreme act of treachery, a stab in the back by their oldest ally. For the next 2 years, the attack ensured that many Frenchmen fought the Allies with more vigour than they had ever fought the Germans. But in London, and crucially, in Washington, D.C., the attack had the intended effect. When Churchill reported the action to the House of Commons, he was met with a standing ovation. The first time all parties united behind him. More importantly, President Franklin D. Roosevelt told his aides that he now believed Britain would stay in the fight. The cold-blooded willingness to attack their own friends to survive proved to the world that Britain would stop at nothing to defeat Hitler. Mers-el-Kébir remains a dark, controversial chapter of World War II, a moment when the desperate necessities of total war overruled the bonds of alliance and friendship, leaving over 1,000 sailors dead in the waters of a North African harbour. At the start of this video, I asked you to pick a number between 1 and 100. For the men aboard the battleship Bretagne, the math of survival was brutal. When the British shells struck the magazine, the ship didn't just sink, it vanished in a pillar of fire. In less than 7 minutes, nearly 1,000 men were gone. Statistically, in that hellish environment, only about 9 out of every 100 men survived. If you chose a number at the start of this video, I want you to look at the screen right now. These are the 9 survivor numbers for today's story. 12, 27, 33, 45, 51, 68, 74, 82, 91. If you picked one of those 9 numbers, you were one of the lucky few. You were pulled from the burning oil, or you managed to find a way out of a capsizing hull in total darkness. If your number isn't on that list, you didn't make it. You were one of the 977 sailors who went down with their ship, not fighting the Germans, but at the hands of the very allies you had been toasting to just weeks before. Mers-el-Kébir remains a scar on the history of both the Royal Navy and the French Republic. A reminder that in total war, the first casualty is often the bond of friendship. If you survived, let us know in the comments also what would you have done if you were the French admiral. And if you didn't, tell us which ship's story we should cover next. As we do at the end of all of our episodes, let's take a moment to remember. So thank you for joining us again. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you again next time.